Welcome everybody to our second roundtable for the UN Habitat 3, Habitat Agenda, the third agenda. It's called the New Urban Agenda, and it's +5, it's 5 years down the track. So it's fairly important for us to go visit that. But we have, you probably read on the screen already, the protocols for how we're going to work. And part of that is that we're going to mute everybody during this process so that we can properly understand and take in the views of our panelists. They're very special people. We're privileged to have them today. But first of all, I think we need to respect the land that we meet on today. I know it's different for every one of us because we're on Zoom. So I'm on Yagurrupal land, which is affectionately known as Runcorn Swamp. But if you'd like to put in your chat box what Indigenous land you're meeting today, that would help us pay proper respect for those who cared for the land for so many thousands of years before us. That brings us also to the United Nations Association of Queensland and hopefully Australia. We have been gifted an anthem that really captures what we're on about. And it was written by Indigenous Auntie Ruby and is performed by Rachel Hall Choir, which is both black and white people, men and women. And I would like to just play that anthem now. Quite a few of us will know the words, so please feel free to sing along. Just put it up nice and loud.
Look after the land, she is a mother.
Honor each person, a sister and brother. Honor the children, share with each other. Rain will come, the land to cover. And rain will come, the land to cover. That's very special to us, and it also helps us gel or appreciate before we get onto community business. So part of the community business today is acknowledging important people here. We need to acknowledge our international, we should have a couple of international people today. So good evening and good morning, international people. We have United Nations Association of Australia Queensland President, Claire Moore. Say hello, Claire.
Hi, everyone.
We have some councillors here. We have Councillor Paul Bishop from Redlands. Hello, Paul. We have
hello.
We have United Nations Association of Australia Young Professionals representative. We don't have our Queensland president here today. I think she's in Melbourne today working. And so in her place, representing the young professionals today is Ritva. Please say hello, Ritva. Right. Ritva Vapola is also going to be our voice for youth today on our panel. It's very important that we have a youth person vocal in every one of our roundtables because they're inheriting what we're doing and the decisions that we're making. But they also are a great inspiration to think differently in some of the sessions, especially that I've been doing recently. So I'm just so proud that we've got young people stepping up and making themselves heard in the next little while. This is the second roundtable of 6. We were supposed to have this as a one day, but of course, between COVID and floods, we ended up opting for the 24th of every month from 4 till 6 or 4 till 5:30. We're going to have a different one of the themes out of this UN Habitat. And you say, well, who cares? Well, a lot of us care. And why does United Nations Association care? Why would the UN care about Australia, and why would it care about South-East Queensland? There's some very good reasons for that. Number one is the UN rapporteur has been to Australia several times. The one came recently. I haven't got the report with me, but that was on Aboriginal housing, and that was quite damning. Also, the UN Observatory has been looking at South-East Queensland since 1976. So I've only been involved for 22 years on doing benchmarking and learning about other regions, 26 regions that we benchmark, but also learning about cities and how other mayors and other community groups, especially the community groups, who do marvellous stuff. And even if it's culturally different from what we do, geez, we can learn a lot. And I've learned a lot, and I hope that we will learn a lot together today as well. So we do care. We do care, and I should also acknowledge that we do care because one of our girls from Monto is now Professor Megan Davis. You may know Megan Davis or heard of her. She is now based in Geneva, but of course with COVID we're not based anywhere, but in wherever we want to be. So she's in Sydney at the moment. Megan Davis is the chair of the Indigenous Expert Panel for Human Rights, and she's the chair for the whole world and all Indigenous people. And that is our daughter, our families, our Queensland family. And coming from Monto, she worked in Townsville and done a lot of wonderful things with human rights. And I wanted to acknowledge the work that she's been doing as well, because the biggest issue that comes up for the Indigenous Expert Panel is basic rights and basic security, and it always comes down to housing and homelessness and security. So that's why I've got that acknowledgement there and why it's important. We've had lots of noise in the media, some of it misrepresenting about housing and about homelessness and what our definitions might be for that. We've also had absolutely wonderful, credible reports from our NGOs and even Oxfam, AHURI, which is the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, and a whole range of others, QCOS, Q Shelter, our own backyards. We've got quite a lot of wonderful, wonderful work, the Lady Musgrave Trust, all those sorts of partners are involved with that. And just yesterday, I think, 10 partners got together and has advocated for a national housing summit and asking the federal government as part of the election process about that. So I think it's nice to have a summit, and it's nice to have stats and benchmarking and all these things, but it absolutely means nothing without the storytelling and without us knowing the sorts of things that really are important to us and our most vulnerable. And that brings us to South-East Queensland. In South-East Queensland, we have the richest adults in the world. Did you know that? We have also the poorest old people and the poorest young people because of the way that they're either students or in vulnerable situations. So how can we say we're an abundant or a caring or equitable region if we have the richest workers who are in good jobs and the poorest people as the weakest link? So when we go measuring ourselves, we really have to go measure the weakest links as well. And we have to acknowledge how that happens and how we can do something about our weakest links. And we've got very good models from around the world and how other areas, cities and regions have addressed these problems, and we could learn a lot from them. Now, I'm not going to say too much at the moment about that, but what I will need to say is the Slido. I'd like to just point your attention to the chat box. In the chat box, and what you might have seen when you on the landing page when you arrived here today, was the Slido. The Slido is a hot link. and you just click on that. Here we are, we've just put that up. Elizabeth's just put that up for you. That allows you to tell us where you're from. It allows you to give us 2 verbs today, 2 action words that we can actually put in our declaration, and please make them very cheeky, because we can work really well as community with very bold verbs and very bold action words. And the third part of the Slido today is your recommendation. Now, you don't have to put anything in that recommendation until at the end of the session after the panelists have spoken, but you might want to be real cheeky and put your recommendation in now, but we won't get to see it until the end of the session. So this is how we can try to use, or we are using, technology. And I wish to acknowledge Ritva, Elizabeth Harrison and Pam Caspani behind the scenes, who are doing most of this wonderful technology that I haven't played with before. And behind the scenes, a lot of wonderful stuff allows us to communicate even though other people might be speaking. Now, before you get sick of my voice, I better do what I'm supposed to be here to do. So, have I done enough with housekeeping, Elizabeth? I hope so.
Yes, you have.
Thank you. Thank you. So with setting the scene, I'll just let you know about Habitat 1, 2 and 3, why we're doing this and why habitat was important. It's habitat for humanity, not habitat for birds or anything else. But guess what? We all live together, so it probably does include birds. Habitat 1 was 1976 in Istanbul. It was really important because it set a 20-year agenda about how we could live better as young people were moving from the rural areas into the cities. So that was all about infrastructure and to make life, especially infrastructure for water and sanitation, but definitely infrastructure for transportation, housing, and emergency, hospitals and schools. So that was really important back in Habitat 1. Habitat 2, we realised that people were falling through the cracks. There was a lot of human rights abuses. There were the inequality was running rampant, terrible. So Habitat 2 was all about keys to the city, and it was all about human rights. It was all about making sure that people weren't being left behind. And that was a 20-year agenda that was in Vancouver in 1996. And then Habitat 3 has just happened in 2016, at the end of 2016. And it was really important because it was all about regeneration, making our cities safe places, but also green places, very sensitive to climate change and not human health, but a lot of natural health and natural environment and economic engine rooms, that we could have sustainable futures in intensive and dense living situations and how to make the best of that. So Habitat 3 in Quito was really special. And that's what we're measuring today. We're benchmarking. We've been benchmarking forever, and the benchmarks change. So why are the benchmarks changed? Well, in the olden days, we just look at social mapping. And if anyone does Bureau statistics mapping, red and white, red is where the poor people live and white is where the rich people live. And that is bloody useless. I better be a bit more diplomatic than that. It was less than useful to us because it didn't map where the vulnerable people were or where the cost of livings were allocated. So you could, even though you might have had a small income, you might have lived a very high quality of life. So we had to change the way we did, where do the rich live and where do the poor, and just throw money at the poor. It doesn't work. It isn't, that raw information is useless. So the vulnerability mapping looked at how much do you spend percentage on food and energy and fuel. And in South-East Queensland, we did the vulnerability mapping, and it came up absolutely much different from what we expected. a lot of it depended on how much of the household, how many cars were in the household, how many kids were in the household, and how many trips, because fuel was becoming up to 50% of the household budget, not just one person's budget, the whole household budget. And there were quite a few things in there that were very telling. And that, you know, you could get your cheap blocks of land further from the city, but guess what? If you lived in the city, if you worked in the city, or you had to have kids that went to schools that somewhere else, you were in that vulnerability and in that area. You thought you were rich, but you really weren't, because there was significantly much more money going out of the household than one would have thought. So when we looked at the vulnerability mapping rather than the social mapping from the Bureau of Statistics, the raw mapping, we had an obligation to look after those who were in the most vulnerable areas. And we put those vulnerability mapping to our governments, and the governments did not accept the reports, because part of the reason for not accepting the report is that there is no necessity to acknowledge them or work with them. Now, some informed professionals who work inside government did actually apply those reports, and we did get some successes. So I'm not being damning for everybody, but good information stands up no matter what. No matter what colour governments are or what other things happen, good information stands on its own feet. So first of all, I have to say we don't have to rely on raw knee-jerk reactions, and that's what our governments tend to do, and our federal governments tend to throw money at the first thing that sounds right, and that's really a policy immaturity. Okay, we also have a change in demographics in the last 60 years. We have and in South-East Queensland, we still have changes in demographics. And of course, in the last 3 years, of course, we've had COVID, an economic crash, no overseas students, very few refugees. We've had our mix over time has been quite different. And our cities have actually, some of our cities were ghost towns, and some of now our rural cities are burgeoning. So we've got a funny mix at the moment. So when we talk about South-East Queensland, we've got 6 cities, 47 urban centres, we have 137 towns, and lots of rural towns and villages. So when we talk about South-East Queensland, it's not just George Street, Brisbane, or Broadbeach in Gold Coast. It's a lot more than that. So when we look at the other thing we need to look at are needs assessment. What are our needs for housing? And then we don't have stagnant needs. During the whole of life, our needs for the single person, the working person, the student is very, very different from mum and kids. It's very different from grandma, whether grandma becomes part of the nuclear family, or whether grandma has to live in a garden shed, which one is doing on the Sunshine Coast at the moment. God help her. But that came out of one of our roundtables with one of our community groups the other day. I was quite shocked by that. We really need to look at the type of housing that we need during the whole of life, but also the type of housing as we become more sophisticated in living in denser areas. So the special design areas is really where the urban design people come in. But it's also our planners. It's ourselves. If we want an apartment, we know that we can't take all our stuff from a 3-bedroom or 5 or 6-bedroom home into a tiny little apartment and expect to live comfortably. We know that we have to change our lifestyle. And as we get older, we don't want to pay big mortgages. We want to be able to have either a support system or rent. But rent is another big ugly thing that we'll talk about later as well. We also need to worry about design for disability. 8% of, just a minute, a lot of us over 60 are going to be disabled, or at least not be able to run upstairs. Therefore, we're looking at an ageing population at a significant rate. It's gone from, I had the stats in my head, but I think 1 in 11 at the moment. It's going to be 1 in 6 in the next 10 years are going to be over 60 and needing other special attention for housing or retrofitting or whatever. So the thing is, we need to worry about design for disability and design for dementia. Dementia is the big concern that we have, and that's on the bad side. On the good side, Australia is looking at having a new blue zone. For those of you who don't know what a blue zone is, there's only 5 places in the world at the moment with a blue zone, and that's where a high concentration of people over 100 years old who are living a good quality of life. And we're looking at having a blue zone in one of the Western Australian cities. So, you know, it's not all bad news. Australia's not all bad news, and South-East Queensland could be right up there too if we did our homework, and if we did things in a proper, precise fashion. We could have Sunshine Coast as that, or even in the hinterlands. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We also have to think about the crisis. We go from crisis to crisis at the moment, and some of our decisions are being made, you know, on the hop. We're not taking the long-term horizons that some of our forebears may have done, like 30-year decisions for housing. We sort of look at 3 years and the attitude of a house as a home versus the attitude of a house as an investment. And we may need to think about that sort of attitude when it comes to how do we make decisions where to invest, or where to, well, especially under floods. We'll talk about floods in our panel session, I'm sure. But every cyclone and flood and fire, we're going to have there's going to be people who are displaced. There's going to be houses that will never be built again. There will be people who have to change their lives considerably. Or we can take an attitude of long-term investment in this thing that we call a home, a house. So the long-term investment means that we look at building back better, building back green, don't build there at all. The Indigenous people involved and encouraged us to have a law in all Queensland coastal regions. The law went from 1908 to 2008, and it was repealed. And it says don't live in the swamp, and don't live in the wetlands. So that sort of attitude carried through for a whole 100 years, and then we lost that. So what do? We've been draining the wetlands. We've been putting acid sulfate, buildings on acid sulfate soil, and wonder why they have concrete cancer in 10 years. So the thing is, some of the laws that have been there a long, long time and have been recently repealed, we really do scratch our heads and say, well, you know, they were probably right 100 years ago. So the whole idea of the longevity and an investment, a home being an investment for multiple generations, really has to be one of the things we have to consider in the housing equation or the formula. What are the triggers? What are the triggers to make life better, given that everything's so damn expensive? And that young people, 4/5 of young people may never own a home now. And if they do own a home, it'll be when grandma dies or when mum and dad dies. So the thing is, that's a really, it's been an issue in Europe for some time, and of course in England. But this multiple use infrastructure means shared assets. It means what are the sorts of things that we can do to invest in the long term for the greatest benefit for the most of the community, so that no one has to buy 10 of this and 1 of that. So carpooling is a good example, but there's a lot more than that. In the Indigenous and the other Pacific and Asian countries, we look at community kitchens, community gardens, community everything, and they only look at the place they go to sleep at night as their own place. So that's a really different attitude to what we have here. We have to buy every asset and every bloody toaster and everything ourselves. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be so wasteful, perhaps. It also means that we could live on less and share more. And I know there's rules about sharing, but that's fairly important as well. But when it comes to multiple use infrastructure and triggers for the future, I need to acknowledge the human rights framework for the Olympics and so the construction and those sorts of things. We had the human rights framework for the Commonwealth, and Susan Harris-Rimmer, you probably know her, Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer from Griffith University. She was the chair of that, and she also was involved with other major sporting events around the world in making sure that we have a human rights approach to construction, to legacy, to a whole range of other things. That was contracting, procurement, ethical procurement, non-slavery, all sorts of other sorts of things that were involved with that. And I'm still talking about shared infrastructure here. The SEQ City deal has just been signed this week as well. You've probably seen quite a lot of that in the media. I hope I'm not putting you to sleep there, Steve, but the City deal is not just George Street, Brisbane, or Queen Street, Brisbane. The City deal is all of SEQ, and it's looking at how we can do better infrastructure and better community benefits out of this, and it's going to need community input into this, not just flashy, impressive, elegant Taj Mahals. Sorry, Palani, I meant white elephants. The thing is, we need to learn what we've done from other countries. We need to also acknowledge that there's been good work with $2.1 billion being put towards housing over, I think it's 5 years in Queensland. And that was like the end of last year. And I would like to monitor how that is being implemented and who benefits. I mean, it's all very nice to have something in a political statement. We want to know, how does this get delivered to community? And that's, otherwise it's just fluff. And I don't like measuring fluff. I don't think anybody does. I really like to measure the good news stories, and there are some really good news stories as well. Now, what's the situation now? Now we have couch surfing. If, for those people who don't know what couch surfing is, someone stays on your spare bed, spare lounge chair, spare whatever. They generally tend to be young men or men. They get lost in the statistics. We don't find them. But now couch surfing has got a manual and it has an agreement. So it becomes some sort of tenure at the moment. And there's rules about how to be a good couch surfer and how to be a good couch host. So that's something really new and different and possible, that we acknowledge that there's a whole population out there who couch surf. And that's another housing option that we never had on the table previously. And so we've got to acknowledge it and help those couch surfers to get to the next level, if that's a possibility. And I know mental health might be an issue with that, but you know what? Everyone loves to be independent to some extent. Okay, or have their private space at least. Okay, we have families who live in cars. I think there was 5,000 families who were mothers and kids who were living in cars at the Gold Coast at one of the recent surveys that we had by community. We have grannies in the garden shed, which I spoke about, and we have what we call the working poor. So we might have 2 people in the household working and they really can't get ahead. Now, if you can't get ahead with a 2% mortgage rate, when are you going to get ahead? Because the mortgage rates are going to rise. And, you know, how do we give these people a bit of a hand up? How, you know, the working poor has been a real issue in other countries as well. So it's not just us. Learning from benchmarking. So I can talk about stats and maps and all those sorts of things, and I'm not going to bore you with that. But the storytelling and what we do in other places really helps us to think differently. Instead of putting band-aids on a big issue, we can pull back and say, this is what the issue is, this is how they've done it in other places. And there are some good lessons learned, and there's some that we wouldn't touch with a 40-foot pole, and we won't. You know, we would really sincerely hope that we would not invest in something that's gone a bit pear-shaped somewhere else. But that might be what happens. So it's up to us, to community, to step up and say, no, this is not the right way to go. Please look at these 3 other options. So that's up to us. And we can only find those things out when we tell stories, and when we, like our panelists today will be doing that. I want us to look at the Urban Design Commissioner that South Australia had, and the reason for appointing the Urban Design Commissioner, who I now still work with, was that there was such a lot of poor people in South Australia falling through the cracks. And not poor people, but vulnerable people, also working poor. Some good things came out of that, and some good things what to keep away from as well. We have sustainability commissioners in 16 jurisdictions who have done wonderful things when it comes to housing. In Rotterdam, the mayor, who is an Egyptian Islamic mayor, came to, it was the mayor of Rotterdam a couple of years ago. A young girl died under the bridge of pneumonia. She was 5 years old, and it totally changed on his watch. And that totally changed the way that they did housing in Rotterdam. 3 cities immediately within 5 years, and now 3 countries are joined together to do that model. So there are good things we can do. In Singapore, of course, it's a very different formula, because the government owns 90% of the land. When government owns the land, it has a great imprimatur from community to do certain things. It is an island. It only has 1 level of government. Oh, it has tricky ones, but really 1 level of government to get those sorts of developments happening so that nobody is left behind. We have London, and we have some of the low developing countries do really great things with community assets. So you don't have to be poor or rich, you just have to have compassion to address some of these things. In future roundtables, we're going to be talking about some of the mechanisms that make our cities compassionate and livable and ethical, and so that we can be proud of them, but it also to make them richer and to be an engine room so that we can do more with less. We can just do more and have better quality of life. So considering South Australia is one of the richest countries in the world, we're only as rich as our weakest link. And when the UN Rapporteur comes to Australia and comes and reviews our housing, we were left a little bit wanting. So we can do better. We do okay on some pockets of excellence, but we do pretty shitty, and especially after the series of crises that we've had recently. So I hope that's a good enough grounding to talk about housing, that it's not just one issue. It's not just older women. It's not just refugees who are not being properly cared for. It's not just the working poor, might be us, you know. It's not just student accommodation at South Bank. It's not, it's the whole perspective needs to be look at systemically, and we can put band-aids on the other little ones, but we really do need to step back a little bit from every crisis, look long-term, and that's very brave to look 50 years or 30 years in the future, and think of ourselves. Where are we going to be in 30 years, and how can we prepare for our own future so that we're not a burden on future generations? And how could we make it easier and better for younger generations to be as secure as we have been in our lives? So on that note, I'd like to introduce our panel, because you need to listen to a different voice. So are we happy to go to Palani? I'd like to introduce Palani. He's our Vice President for United Nations Association of Australia, but he's a lot more than that. He has an amazing history. He's a social worker originally, but he's also a person we go to, or the government or whoever taps on the shoulders whenever we have a disaster in Queensland. He's up there looking after the first 3 days, He is the man who's on the job a lot with a lot of others, of course, and you've got a lot of lived experience with a diverse population. So I'd like to hand over to Palani as our provocateur for our special panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Davis, Donald Davis, who has been an active leader in UNAA Queensland and also in many other community groups, and she held many positions across the sectors. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. Because otherwise I will be talking, I won't know what's happening. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we are meeting and sitting across Queensland, I believe, and speaking. This has been a great sacred land, and this has been given for us to spend time and live in our life. And also we need to be very respectful of elders past, present, and emerging. I always admire the indigenous people who have looked after this land for generations, and we are still living happily and struggling, but there are a lot of things this land is contributing, and I also wanting to appreciate the indigenous people. I would like to acknowledge the president of UNAA Queensland, Claire Moore, and all other distinguished guests and the speakers. And also I can see a number of people, you've been very actively contributing to the community in your everyday life. And that's something really I admire. I also wanted to thank you and taking the opportunity to welcome you all to spend a bit of time to think something very, very important issue for everyone. And the housing needs is everyone's business. There is no rich or poor. There is no any whether special needs or whatever situation, we all need housing. We are living in a very modernized world, very technologically, very advanced world. Even when we are talking about war, the way arms are created, invented, the way the people are fighting against each other, and things are really advanced. Even today, we are spending time on Zoom and the online virtual forum. This is something, it's great. I really admire that. Are we really fulfilling the basic needs of the community, every individual needs? That's the question that remains with so many people. This morning I got up and I got ready and I was traveling to work. 2 radio stations, there were 2 different issues, 2 different times, they were talking about housing issue. Housing and become a bigger issue. I wanted to see what's happening, whether you are living in the rural part of the world or the developing country or the developed country or with the biggest urbanized sector. The crisis never been solved. I always wanted to thank, but appreciate what the government is putting effort. I'm not going to disagree with that, but is that enough? Not enough. So who can do this whole thing? Is that the government only can fix the whole issue? Probably not. Every individual has a role to play. Yes, every community has a role to play. And this is where, this is very important issue. I would like to say, this is not an issue we can read and intellectually debate or discuss and forget and go to sleep and get up in the morning and go back to our routine. This is not the issue. A lot of basic needs are not addressed until now. When I was looking at the SDG 17 SDG goals, Australia has a very better position to be an example to follow, implement all those 17 goals. I don't know how many people will agree or not. That's not the I'm expecting, but we can be a leader in many ways to fulfill the needs of the community, because we are only 25 million of people. And people might have a various reason, excuses. Yes, I'm not going to disagree with that. But are we going to continuously express the issues and forget about it? But what's happening? The needs are increasing and the supply is decreasing. That is not the way to find a solution. I was, when I was doing some community recovery work after disaster, well, there was one lady, she came to that recovery center. She was saying, I'm going to kill myself. Everybody was shocked because we don't know what's going on in her life. And then people ran to me and asked me, can you talk to her? I had a chat. I asked her, have you had anything to eat? Have you had anything to drink? I just offered her first. I don't know what, just it works, whatever comes naturally. You don't try to be a professional, you just be a human. That's what I was trying to do. And then I wanted to listen to her. When I listened to her, the biggest challenge she was going through, she's got children. She lost her rental property in the flood. The landowner was creating a lot of problem. She's not able to manage. She's not able to find alternative accommodation. She's not able to see any future in her life at that time. So that's why she was expressing and how she was going through that. But then we were able to manage and support her and refer. And when afterwards he came back and thanked me. But that is just one example. We can talk a lot of issues, even with COVID, created a lot of problems. The demand is increasing. And when there was a COVID peak started, people were trying to reduce the rent. As soon as the government giving us some safety net, and then people started increasing the rent per week, minimum $50 to $100, that is not going to be affordable for a student. That is not going to be affordable for even any regular income earners. These are the things people are going through in their life. So what I would like to do, I wanted to thank the way how Denal Davis explained the whole overview of that issues and beautifully summarized. And now this is another opportunity. And I would like to ask everyone to please turn the video on if you are comfortable. The reason is it would be good to have a bit of interactions. And as you know, this is being recorded and I hope people don't have any issue. But I'm going to invite 3 panel of speakers and ask them to, I think I might ask Denal to introduce them who they are, but then I will ask the question to all 3 of them. And is that okay, Denal?
Yes, I'm sorry. I just didn't want to take up too much time earlier. We are very privileged to have Emma Greenhalgh. Emma's just started a brand new job, but she's got an enormous career behind her. She just declared herself as an introvert. Well, I've never imagined you as that, because she's been able to do such a marvelous things. And it's not, you don't have to be on the front page of the paper to be able to have respect and credibility in the industry. So Emma's been respected for a long, long time. She doesn't even know that probably because nobody tells you. But Emma's now the Executive Director, I think, of National Shelter and Homelessness Policy. However, she's been with Q Shelter for some time. She's a planner, but I think you're a social planner rather than a spatial planner. But spatial is social anyway, as if we're going to split hairs on these things. You can't be one without the other, really. But I won't go on too long, except that Emma, you've been an inspiration to a lot of young people as well. And that's why I really wanted you to be part of today. Rachel Watson. Rachel was recommended to me for us to have lunch together a year ago, and guess what? We still haven't got to lunch, and I'll blame COVID and everything else on that. But Rachel runs the housing lab still, and that's important because it's got a whole heap of wonderful people involved with that, and I want to know more about your housing lab. But also we need people to tell their stories, but we also need someone to bring those stories together and make sense of them. So Rachel, you're our wonderful leader and with a reputation in that area. So thank you very much for making time for us today. And of course, our third speaker is Ritva Vilpola. It's really important that every time we have a roundtable, we have a young voice. And Ritva is an architectural scientist. I think I said that before, but which is a very flash name of making sure that that we live well spatially, and it's appropriate for our needs, really important. But she's also on the Urban Design Alliance, and she's one of our UN young professionals who's just won a very coveted scholarship. So we're very proud of you, Ritva. But as a voice of the young people, we're putting a lot of responsibility on your shoulders to be able to explain how other young people live, not just yourself. So I think that's probably enough from me for introductions. Thank you, Palani.
Thank you, Danelle, and you've done a fabulous job again. And on behalf of the team today, I welcome 3 panel speakers. And I am at the end of this session, I wanted to see if we have a solution for every Australian to have a guaranteed shelter. That is my dream. That's been a dream for many years. I wanted to see that's going to happen. It is possible. How that's going to be possible, I think that's something I would like to listen to every one of you, and also get other people's view, how this can be really viable in Australia. And I'm going to ask, probably in order, Emma is the first speaker, and Rachel, then Ritva. And I'm going to provide the question and then ask you to summarize your brief. And then we will also provide opportunity for others to have a question. But Dr. Danelle Davis will be monitoring time. And but I think we might be going over the planned time. However, she will be able to give you a bit of a warning, and so then you can prepare to start. But our quest for finding a solution is not to be stopped, but is only to stop the speaking part. And now there are a couple of things I'm going to provide that scenario and questions. Many impacts over the last 5 years prevented fairer housing options. From your professional perspective, where are we now? That's one. Then second question, how can we house our most vulnerable? How can we house our most vulnerable? What is your vision for adequate and universal housing for South-East Queensland? Even though I was asking for the whole Australia, but even if you are able to provide your overview, I will ask Emma to start giving your speech. And have you understood what I said? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
Emma.
Thanks, Palani. And look, thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today, the Yugambeh language people here on the Gold Coast. There's also a storm floating around, so if power goes out and I disappear, that's why. Yeah, big questions that we've all been grappling with, some a lot longer than others. and just some reflections that I've had in the last sort of few days, you know, we've been seeing in the media, it's always been that we've been talking about a housing crisis. There was an article recently by Michael Pascoe, the economist, in the New Daily, and I think in my own sort of thoughts, I'm at the point of agreeing with him when he says, you know, we have a national emergency. I think by the nature of, you know, I think 5 years, 10 years ago, you know, there really was a lot of the othering, I think, in the relation to how we spoke about housing, because, you know, there were solutions available for people who might have been sort of on the lower middle income sort of spectrum. It wasn't at the sort of way that it is now. So probably, you know, there was that sort of othering. And I think by every sort of measure that we have right now, you know, in South-East Queensland and in Queensland, you know, the situation is dire, you know, in terms of what we are seeing in terms of the increases in private rental costs, in terms of the vacancies, you know, the options that have traditionally been available for people to potentially move regionally, even though that's not the best option. You know, for a lot of people, they're not available anymore because of the regional housing market and what's occurred during COVID. When it comes to home ownership, you know, your ability to save for a deposit, you know, the value of housing is absolutely outstripping people's ability to save. You can't save $1,200, you know, a week on top of what you were already saving. It's just completely unfeasible. And then when it comes to social housing, that, you know, we've had a great investment by the state in the last 12 months, but that really is playing catch up, you know, to a sector that has been underfunded for so long, you know, where the waiting list is, you know, significant. And I think where it's become, you know, such a residualized sector that, you know, the economics of it are really, really difficult. And I think the other thing, you know, around that as well is that what we're seeing is an absolute lack of urgency around this, an absolute lack of leadership, you know, particularly at the federal level, where the federal government has been really clear by stating that, you know, their response to housing is essentially NIFIC, and that housing and homelessness is a state responsibility. So, you know, they are walking away from what they see their role is in relation to housing, particularly for vulnerable people. You know, they'll provide, you know, demand side or programs that will enhance demand, such as first home owners grant and home builder. But I think in any other sort of social component, they're really walking away from that. And I think reflecting on, you know, Danelle, what you sort of putting forward about where it is that we want to be in 30 years, that I think part of the discussion that really has to be put on the table is not about where do we plan to be on in 30 years, but based on what we have seen in the last 5 years and what's currently going on at the moment, what are the kinds of issues that we are going to have to be grappling with in 10, 20, 30 years as a result of this national emergency? In terms of, and there's a report that came out today, for example, around the importance in terms of mental health is security. It doesn't matter whether it's rental or home ownership, it's security. What are the kinds of issues that we're going to be dealing with in relation to children in 10, 20 years because of the issues that, you know, families are having to deal with now for housing? So it really is, you know, the crunch time around decision making for government. And at the National Housing Conference recently, there was an economist, I think Elizabeth Jackson, you know, who said governments make a choice about the policies that they make every day, and they're making a choice right now when it comes to housing. The thing is that people are having to make their own choices right now based on the choices that government are making. You know, and right now that is about am I paying my rent? Do I have a place to sleep on top of now with, you know, other costs of living? And one of the key issues to this, I think, is we have a whole range of solutions, you know, that we know will work, but what we're needing around this is real political will in terms of making some very tough decisions about how we see housing. Is it an investment vehicle or is it a shelter? And what are the tax treatments and all of those kinds of things that sit down to that? But while that's a real political decision, it's also a real community decision as well, for communities to be saying, you know, I think, you know, our communities deserve a lot more than this, and putting that pressure back onto politicians in terms of doing better. And I think the other thing too, just sort of added to that, and, you know, we've really seen that lately, is what is that layer of climate change, you know, on top of, you know, an existing crisis, an existing emergency. So so I'm going to leave sort of my kind of remarks there for now, and hand it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. That's really, you highlight a very important aspect of the issue. And you have challenged the government and their policy decision making as well, which is important. And now I would like to ask Rachel Watson to provide your overview. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and really hope that we can have some vibrant discussion about the issue, because it is so critically important. And I guess just kind of following on from what Emma said around planning for climate change and what that kind of will mean for us in practice, in that, you know, like a 12-month plan, you know, 3-year strategic plans, we need to start thinking about, well, there's only going to be 10 months in a year, given climate change is going to affect the impacts of disasters. And so that means we have to compact the thinking and the KPIs that we want to see into shorter periods of time, even though the pressure downwards is even more fierce. And so that kind of makes me think then we do need to be looking to other jurisdictions and where is the innovation? There's so much innovation. There's no shortage of great ideas. And how do we scale them into the South-East Queensland context without ending up with a prickly pear situation? You know, that it may seem good, it kind of meets the what we think will work as far as housing vulnerable people and meeting an emergent need, but actually in 20 years or 30 years time, we're left with communities with housing that actually hasn't met their needs in the long term to build community, because the housing is a home and it's about how we connect together in that community. And certainly some thinking that the Housing Action Lab has done is that how do we kind of quickly think about what shifting spaces means, and what a shifting spaces looks like in relation to disaster recovery, and what that looks like in relation to trying to rapidly build a community connection when we build responsive housing to disaster or to this pressing need that we feel. And I guess, you know, I think when Scott Morrison was the housing minister, I remember hearing him say the affordable housing needs a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, that it's the nuanced response. And I think, unfortunately, 5-6 years later, we absolutely need a sledgehammer, because the need is far outweighing, you know, what is on offer. And until there's some leadership at the federal level to create incentives for state and local government to look at planning acts, to look at how to actually create solutions on the micro to impact on the macro. Because I think sometimes with housing we get the feeling that there needs to be so much done, is that it's got to be that big impact, but it's the big impact combined with the little bits joined together that actually will make a difference as well. So a slight turn on the Planning Act to say secondary dwellings, no biggie, that's good, we can do that. Combined with also an investment of 500 units of accommodation, all of a sudden you're getting a bit of a change in what a community looks like. So it's not only high density, but it's actually utilising our land in the best way possible. And certainly the Noosa Council has spent a lot of time thinking about that, knowing that they've got actually really large block size. The average block size of Noosa is quite large. They've built out all the foreshore. So their planning act is about, they really want secondary dwellings. So that's to house, so people can stay, families can stay together longer, perhaps first homeowners can then rent out the secondary dwelling, so things become more affordable, also for older women. So the issues around older women and their participation in their local community is getting severed at every turn because they can't stay in the community perhaps that they've brought their children up in. They can't stay in the community where they're working because it's just not affordable for them. And some workshops that I was involved with some older women, the stories they were telling us around, they will take, one woman talked about taking a room in an old Queenslander, no air conditioning, and so it was a roof over her head and a door she could lock, but she spent all day at the library because it was so hot. She could not be in that room, and she didn't have enough extra financial resources to install air conditioning or to be paying electricity for a fan. And you think, well, she's found a shelter solution, but that's not a home. That's not a place that her grandchildren are going to be visiting her. It's not a place she's going to grow and nurture. So, and that's it is growing. Those options are what actually, particularly older women, as far as women over 55 are experiencing, that relying on family members to subsidise their rent. That's not a long-term solution, and it's relying on everyone having everything stable. And I think what we've learned from COVID is, it's a roller coaster ride. It's on, it's off, it's long, and so those previous processes that people were able to use to perhaps subsidise their housing is not going to see them into the future. And I guess my last bit of thinking is, like if we were able to pursue a universal basic income, then that certainly actually has a significant impact in the housing space. We know that if there's the results of research overseas is when a universal basic income has been trialled, volunteering goes up. When we have volunteering going up, we have cohesiveness and connection in communities. Sports clubs thrive. School canteens thrive. Connection together of women thrive. Innovation thrives because people can actually think and create and be together. And I know it has been discussed a little bit recently, but so it may not be about investing everything in hard infrastructure for housing, but also pulling a lever around universal basic income, because then we actually get the community growth component that we're all seeking. We don't want to live in a house that we don't know anyone or there's conflict. We want to build community around us in our homes. That's me for now.
Thank you, Rachel. That's great. You've taken us to different parts of South-East Queensland as well, and highlighted how even with elderly women, they cannot even live in their own home. That's been a pretty big challenges. And often the elders, they contribute to the community. Many voluntary works are still done by elders. And we are able to receive one end, but we are not able to cater their needs, which is a challenging. Thank you. And now, can I invite Ritva to share your thoughts? Thank you.
Thanks, Palani. Hi, everyone. I'm Ritva. I'm on Jinnabara country, so I'm based in Malani in the Sunshine Coast. So I thought I'd probably give a brief history on sort of like how I've lived, I guess, from where I was raised. So I grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I grew up in a very typical suburban home in a suburb in Auckland, New Zealand. And it was single dwelling. I didn't have much exposure to any other kind of housing type aside from having a couple of family friends who actually did live in social housing from the government. So we had a few people who did live in an apartment, like a newly built apartment from the New Zealand government. We had someone who lived in a duplex, but it was very dilapidated. It was so old, it was basically just crumbling, really. But there was actually space in the backyard, and they were able to actually grow fruits and vegetables and share it with their neighbours. That was on the other side of their duplex. And then we also had a family friend who lived in a detached dwelling, which was actually privatised. So the government actually sold that social housing to them in order to own and do what they wanted. And this stuff like never really occurred to me when I was a child. I was just like, oh yeah, like, you know, different types of housing, different people living in different places. But when I reflect on it now, it's like, oh wow, yeah, like there are definitely a lot of issues when it comes to providing housing. And I think one that was really big for me was that we actually had a suburb right next to us who had a lot of social housing and a lot of Māori and Pacifica children who lived there, and I tutored them at the local primary school, public primary school. And there was something that I learnt about how the rate of rheumatic fever, because of poor quality, which is what Rachel explained as well, is that, yeah, a lot of children are getting sick with strep throat. Like that's a pretty common cold symptom for us in New Zealand, because it's just cold in New Zealand and we just don't have good insulation. Like it's only very recently that the building code actually added like roofing insulation. So we're freezing our butts off basically inside. And not only that, it's moldy. And that's how children are getting rheumatic fever. It's just developing into their hearts and their lungs. And they need to go, like worst cases, they go to have to get operated on. And that was like a really big kind of, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is shocking. Like as a kid, I was like, what is going on? And then I moved down to Wellington. So I studied architectural science in Wellington. And I absolutely acknowledge my privilege in the sense that I was able to go to a hall of residence, which is kind of deemed as colleges at UQ. And so, but that's not accessible for everyone. Like it's very expensive to live in a hall of residence as a student. And so for us, it was only, you got to live in there for 1 year. I remember my partner studied at UQ. So he was saying that you can live in the hall of residence for up to 3 or 4 years. But in New Zealand, it was 1 year. And then after 1 year, you would move out and find flats. And I remember the first flat I moved into, and it was actually a really nice apartment. It was owned by a housing organization that really did cater towards students because it was very cheap, but it was very cheap for a specific reason. And that was because we had 5 rooms in our unit. 2 of them were internal, so there was no window to the outside. 2 of them had windows to the outside and which were openable. And 1 of them had a window to the outside, but it wasn't openable. So there was no ventilation. And so the internal rooms also didn't have ventilation as well. And like, when I reflect back on it, like, yeah, it was a really fun time as a student. We had a great community. Like we had a good living space. We knew people next door to us on the floors below. Like it was very, very community vibes, but the quality was just pretty horrific. Like when I think about it now, I'm just like, oh gosh, like how was this built to code? And it very much wasn't. And so then I remember moving to another flat, which was owned by a landlord, so an individual. He rented out the space, which was the main housing area. And then he had sort of renovated the kind of shed or garage space under the house as an extra unit. And that was where we lived for a year or so. But because it was like a renovated garden shed, it also didn't meet code. It didn't need to, in the sense that he built it before these more stringent code requirements. And so it was moldy, super humid, like ridiculously humid. We had to constantly have the dehumidifier on. And that like got a lot of us sick as well. It was just because it was just always cold, wasn't insulated properly. And this isn't like, this is me as a student who ultimately could afford a place to live, in the sense that, yes, I got a bit of student allowance. In fact, renting costed more than our student allowance. So we actually needed to work part-time basically, or have parents help us pay rent because student allowance was so bad. And I think that's something that actually is quite similar when it comes to talking with my friends who grew up here and were students here. The student allowance is just so low that you really can't afford much more after you pay rent. And that is a huge problem, because then people forget about nutrition. I think as students, we don't really think about nutrition in the first place. So that's a problem within itself. But that's the thing, we also couldn't really afford good nutrition or fresh fruits and vegetables. And so that's kind of like my experience as living, and then also living in an apartment in Brisbane when I first moved over. I lived on King Street, which was one of the apartments built by Lend-Lease. It's a hot box. It was just hot all year round, terrible ventilation because it was just facing north and it didn't have cross flow ventilation. And as someone who's, learned about building physics and all of that, it was just, disaster really. And people buy these places not actually thinking about it, and then having to pay insane amounts of money for electricity, air conditioning to actually cool down the place. So in terms of housing quality, it is just, it's a nightmare throughout my experiences in New Zealand and Australia. And now I live in Maleny, and it's been an interesting experience because we moved over like during COVID, and I now help out at the Maleny Neighbourhood Centre. And it's been a really interesting experience in the sense that there are so many problems that come through the neighbourhood centre, because we're kind of like the external facing community helper in terms of emergency relief. And hearing that just so many people are getting pushed out of their homes as long-term renters in Maleny, like they've created their community in Maleny, they've lived here for over 20 years, and now they're being pushed out because either the landlords want to sell their home because the price values have just skyrocketed, or the landlords want to move back into the homes that they own basically. And then on top of that, there's over 200 Airbnb options for the tourism industry, but barely any options for people who actually have lived in Maleny or actually want to live in Maleny potentially. And so the rental prices, according to a statistic, it's been increased by 55% since COVID. And that's a huge problem, just from all of the work as someone who's sort of been coordinating housing working groups here. We have a lot of organisations who want to do things, but then there's red tape from council in terms of the town plan, which was another thing that was raised. And just how like tiny homes aren't considered housing. So they're not actually recognised by the building code to actually build to quality or standards. It's very much just temporary housing or caravans, and you can only park in an area for a certain amount of time. So it's not considered long-term housing. And there are organisations who actually want to push for that, because tiny homes is considered a cheaper option for people to live in. For example, low income or even millennials in our generation. But I feel like that also leads to another question, is that what is considered affordable housing. Because when you divide a tiny home square meter rate versus the cost, it's really not that much cheaper. It just sounds cheaper because it's significantly smaller. And not everyone wants to live in a space of a tiny home. Like, yes, it is a great alternative for people who do want to live that lifestyle, but it's not for everyone. And we really need more housing options in that sense. And the other thing is that from working at the neighborhood centre, we are just we do not have enough resources. Like, we have housing programs. We've got Chasm House, which is Compassionate Housing Affordability Solutions Malani, and it's a pilot project. I think it's been a pilot project for quite some time because it's just so hard to get funding for these things. But it is a really great project in the sense that, yes, it's offering accommodation to locals in housing stress, but it is just not enough. Like, 1 or 2 of these buildings is just not enough with the amount of people that come into the neighborhood centre and say that, oh, I've been pushed out of my home. And the other thing is that there are a lot of barriers. We had someone come into the neighborhood centre and they were basically in housing stress, like they didn't have a home to move into. They've been pushed out of their rental and they had a pet. However, because there are issues with pets, for example, being allowed in rentals or and also in Chasm House, like we don't accept people with pets. But the thing is that it's such a traumatic experience, firstly, and then they're expected to go to some emergency housing with a group of strangers that they don't know, and then potentially they don't actually want to even go because they've got pets and other things that they want to be able to bring but ultimately aren't allowed to. And why are we expecting them to give up their beloved pets? Like, why? You know, we should be providing more options for that. And that kind of brings to sort of my experience in terms of, so I've worked like as a sustainability consultant for a commercial practice for the past four years or so. And I worked with a lot of Green Star rating tools, which is a green rating tool for more sustainable design. And these are usually picked up by massive private developers who develop heaps of like single dwelling, apartments, anything. They can get a Green Star certification. Now, the Green Star communities, there is an affordability requirement, but it is not compulsory. So you can still get your green rating or your sustainability rating without ever considering affordability or providing affordable options. And not only that, the requirements are extremely vague. And I remember working with a client on a project in Ipswich, and they were trying to convince me that, oh, no, our housing is totally affordable. It is way cheaper than the average housing price in Brisbane. What? Why are you comparing Brisbane to Ipswich? Firstly, are you assuming that people are going to commute all the way from Brisbane to Ipswich to work or vice versa? And if that is the case, why is this happening? Why are we encouraging people to commute 2 hours or so to the city centre of Brisbane and then expecting them to only be able to afford a house out in Ipswich? Like that doesn't encourage walkability at all. And so that's the commercial side that I have a huge issue with. And so when it comes to kind of like what I envision, it is a very good question. It's a very hard question. I think for me, it's largely to do with understanding having a bit more political literacy amongst everyone. It can't just be a few people who are interested in politics or, oh, sorry, Palani.
No, everybody's interested. And I think we might give a a bit more fair opportunity for everyone. But if you need to say something quickly, please finish it, and then we can come back again.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure.
Yeah.
No, that's good. I guess like in terms of just wrapping it up, for me, it's trying to understand the definitions between personal property and private property. We really need to understand that. The next is, why does renting even exist? You know, is that even a concept we should be accepting? There are a lot of governance structures which the West demonizes. However, they provide housing as a basic necessity. Whereas over here, housing is a commodity. And then the third one is, you know, why not have the state look after all the housing stock? Why not actually be able to look after the housing stock and reallocate the housing? Because really, it's not just a housing affordability, it's access to housing that already exists. And lastly, cooperatives, member-owned democratic processes like housing cooperatives, where you as a renter actually have a voice. And that is also a key thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Ritva. I think you've also taken us to New Zealand and traveled to Melanie. But it's also passionate to listen to you, and also such a being a grassroots worker in the community center and also involved with us. And you have also challenged now why renting exists. That's it's a pretty good question. And but today is when I was reading the newspaper, we have listed the richest people in Queensland or Australia, whatever, and top like 3 or 4 people. 2 of them are property developers. So, and that really gives you the back view how this become a commercial cash crop kind of thing, commercialization of making money. And you are right, some of them like a social housing, cooperative housings exist, but that's not enough, very little. But I thank you for your view. And now you might have seen in the chat box, our technical experts are putting that a link. And if you if you want to ask any questions, I know some of the people have put their questions here. If you could copy and paste it, or that would be good on that link. So because people have a different response and questions, so it would be good to make sure that everybody is given an opportunity. Is that okay, Danelle?
Yes, in fact, I'd like to just pick on a couple of the really wonderful questions that have been put up, and they are a bit cheeky. They are arguing the status quo. One of them is from Kate Crawford, and that was about, should we be making a levy like a Medicare levy towards shelter? Another one is investing for shelter for children as a priority, because the kids are falling through the cracks. And we find that especially where there's housing and violence and that sort of thing, and the kids are, so the rights of the child are not necessarily cared for appropriately. And I think child continues beyond age 21 or beyond 18. And it also includes any children with, or young people with mental illness. I think they need to be in that vulnerability right to, you know, the rights of disabled people that came out of the UN just recently. Yeah, anyway, Queensland signed on to that. Should this need be part of social security? And that part, I think Kate, and this is where I'd like to hand over to Emma and Rachel, that part would be, you know, NRAS, the National Rental Assistance Service that federal government had provided. It's a convoluted process. It's finished. So that whatever good was coming out of that, and security net was coming out of that, doesn't exist after, you know, when the current renters are finished. They're wiped out, they're off. And too bad if their needs have changed. So for just that set of stuff from Kate, would you, Emma and Rachel, want to respond to those?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. And yeah, just to reflect on NRAS, absolutely. You know, the piece of data that I have, you know, looks at what is the split of NRAS properties by number of electorates, you know, in Queensland, particularly marginal electorates. And, you know, it's fairly substantial. Even in my own electorate here, you know, in terms of, I think there's upwards of 750 NRAS properties that are going to, you know, their incentive will be finished fairly shortly. You know, and the impact of that on those households, because in Queensland, NRAS tenants came off the waiting list in Queensland. It was a requirement in Queensland that that's, you know, what happened. So it means that for those people who might have previously had another social housing option, you know, they have to now reapply for social housing, you know, and go back onto the register and, you know, go back through that, you know, sort of particular rigmarole of dealing with the register. Absolutely, in terms of investing in shelter for children as a priority, do agree with that. And, you know, and we know through work that's already been done that it is cheaper to provide housing than be providing hospitals, prisons, all of those kinds of things. We know that, and, you know, and sort of moving on from that, I would actually say, no, I don't think we need a levy. I don't think we need a levy on every household or, you know, income unit in Australia to be paying for housing, because I think based on one, existing budgets, and I think particularly around the realignment of budgets. So, you know, in terms of whether that is coming out of, you know, criminal justice, you know, further down the track in terms of mental health, I think the realignment of a budget to be investing in housing, and I would just have some concerns about saying to people, you know, we're going to put a housing levy on you. I think that would, it's not a debate that I would actually like to be having with the community. I think to me, it definitely is about where we are putting in our existing resources. And I think the other thing too, just sort of aligned sort of with that is, you know, often when, so in the case of Victoria in the last 2 weeks, when they were looking to put the levy for social housing in the new areas for the development industry, and, you know, that was a policy that died a death in, you know, 3 quick days. You know, there's this particular trope that comes out from the development industry that every ask, and whether it's energy efficiency or whether it's going to be doing the livable housing design guidelines or whatever, becomes a tax, you know, on whatever that new home is. And I think in terms of how things are rolled out and the timeframes of which they're rolled out, you know, economically speaking, it always goes back to whatever the value of the land is, you know, and the residual land value. And I think the development industry has a real ownership of the space of housing and directing the politics of that in relation to levies and charges, as opposed to, you know, others in the community and in the sector that are able to come out and go, no, that's actually nonsense. It all goes back to your feasibility and what you're prepared to pay for the land, which would probably end up being, you know, less with all of these other factors thrown in.
Yeah. Rachel, have you got some comments on that?
Yeah, I guess in relation to NRAS, to really think about who was living in NRAS. You know, Indigenous families, larger families, single women, and given that Queensland did have the highest ratio of NRAS properties to any other state, these are all people that are getting tipped into a private rental market that has now got less properties to rent because NRAS doesn't exist, but they're not going to be competitive. So, you know, like we talk, it's about human beings, and it's like someone's grandmother, it's someone's auntie, it's someone's cousin who is now potentially dealing with the stress and anxiety of, well, I might be able to rent somewhere in Gladstone, maybe not. And so the cumulative cost of families, particularly having to have short tenancies, because when we have a housing boom and a low vacancy rate in the rental market, then people go 12-month leases. Let's make them 6-month leases, because then, of course, people can increase the rent every 6 months. So if we think about the cost of that for families, moving schools, the cost of new uniforms, the cost of them not being connected in a local school community, having to do the driving, the drop off, you know, like it's just so obvious when you kind of think both the humans in there, but then the actual financial costs, that you wonder how we keep missing it. How is it we just like go, this is a really silly way to be going, because we're not doing anything to future-proof ourselves against people being alone and isolated and marginalised in the community if they're constantly having to move and create new connections. We're not thinking about that 30-year plan of we want an inclusive, connected, supportive micro communities.
Right. So a few special things come out of that for me, and that links into some of the other people's questions. We've got 10.47% of housing in South-East Queensland is empty, and they don't want to have any renters or anybody in those houses. They're second homes for either overseas or rich people or holiday houses. So it's not a supply issue, it's a attitude issue. In Netherlands, you're only allowed to have 2 houses, one to live in and only 1 rental. If you have more than that, you are severely penalised and encouraged to sell quick. And now that happens in Belgium and Germany and Switzerland, I think. So when you're looking at that, that's and there is a third special bit coming out of that, and I forgot what it was, so I'm sorry. Now, Rachel, you've got a daughter to pick up shortly.
I do. I'm really sorry. Today I'm all days. Things have gone haywire. Normally it's a smooth plan, but I will need to duck out at about 10 to 6. Yes, sorry.
Please, yeah. And Ritva, do you have anything to add? No, you are muted.
Yeah, sorry. There's been some really great discussions. I saw Elizabeth also posted in the chat in regards to heat island effect. And yeah, that is a very big one. And interestingly, Brisbane does significantly better in terms of green coverage than Melbourne and Sydney. And that's really saying something, because when I remember living in Brisbane, I was just like, this heat island effect is shocking, absolutely ridiculous. Because you notice a difference from like just driving from Brisbane to the sunny coast, and it's just cooler in the sunny coast, but it is still incredibly hot. And I honestly don't know a solution for that. Like, there are, for example, green roofs, but these green roofs need to be designed really well. And same with green walls. They need to be designed really well. And a lot of the time you can see green walls just like dying because they just haven't been the plants haven't been selected properly. And yeah, in terms of subtropical design, it is a really important one. And I understand the council has provided subtropical design guides in terms of, you know, what could
QUT, and yeah, the community also did that. However, 13 years ago, I built to tropical design because we knew climate change was coming. I took a lot of Darwin and tropical design around Asia and whatever, and some of the Caribbean islands, and I introduced those into the housing that I built. So I'm not one of those terrible developers. I'm a grandma developer, but it's designed for older women and for disability, and I want to retrofit it for dementia because I might have to live in it one day. So I'm thinking my 30 years ahead too. Sorry, Merva, did you want to? You're on mute, Merva. We can't hear anything.
I'm sorry. I'm just wondering about one, I guess it's a social aspect and an economic aspect too. New Zealand aged pensioners can earn up to $160 a week before their supported living payment is affected. And Australian pensioners, if you earn anything, your pension is immediately affected. So I think there's probably a bit of advocacy and politicking that we could do here to get some support for various groups of pensioners that might make, you know, their living a little bit more affordable.
Yeah. Now, the people who fall through the cracks in that area, the older women who've got recently divorced, the older women who've never worked their whole lives, and rent is just shocking. So yes, you can understand why they're living in the garden shed, but that is horrible. That is an indictment of our rich community, our rich environment when we've got such inequity. However, I'm just going to go through. Someone else has got a hand up, have they?
If people wanting to ask any question, I know a number of questions are coming up. I think there are some very, very important question too. Would you like to put your hands up and then quickly share your question or thoughts, please?
Okay, I've tried to do the right thing, and I'm sorry, I should have been plugging our Slido. Slido is in the chat box. It's where you come from. Give us 2 verbs. Now, we haven't had much time to talk about 2 verbs, but some beautiful verbs have been coming out of your mouths. So I'd like us to take 1 minute to jump over into the Slido and put your action words. Now, they can be, sort of 4 or 5 action words, but they will come up in a word map, and that will capture what we've been talking about today in a picture. And I'll send that to you, each of you. Then the third part is, what is your recommendation for the future? So the thing is, because we need to have everyone having a voice today, we want to make sure that what your recommendations or what you'd like to see in the future. We probably won't go further with the extra levy because we're already paying taxes and they're going to bloody submarines, and they could be going somewhere else, but that's another story. We could have much better use of the taxes and the funds and the revolving funds that are already there. So please jump over to the Slido and do that so that we don't lose your input if you haven't had a chance. Wonderful, wonderful. Look at those words that are coming up. Is this a live one, Elizabeth? Is it changing as we speak?
It is if people enter in their words, yes.
Yes, well, I've been slack, I haven't.
There should be a link in the chat box.
Right, okay. While we're doing that, Paul has a question. Paul Bishop?
Yes, hello, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
A very interesting point, I believe, is ownership and the agglomeration of wealth over the last 2 decades in this country into the landowners. I remember having a house in Melbourne that I was able to buy in 1998 for $179,000. A year later, it was worth $279,000, and now it is in the multiple millions of dollars. Just in the 2 years of COVID, apparently the equivalent amount of all of the economic stimulus that went to JobSeeker and JobKeeper initially went broadly, but has effectively gone straight onto the property market. There are individuals whose net worth has gone through the roof at a time when the cost of living across every other sector has gone sky high. This is a big macro issue, and when you look at the sorts of people who fund the elected representatives, not myself included as an independent, it's a big ethical macro dilemma that we have, because I think all levels of government are supported by and encouraged to do the behest of those who are the landed gentry, the elite. And I think the barriers to change really sit there. And I think the distribution of wealth from the majority, the Commonwealth, which was where all our funds were, has gone into net debt, but it's been transferred into the ownership of individuals. I think there needs to be a look at that macro shift, and there needs to be a refocus on how that can be redistributive and regenerative. And I believe that Ritva's suggestion about member-owned cooperatives and equity crowdfunding solutions where we redistribute our collective wealth, if we think about how much money people have got in their superannuation, if we were to actively design systems where people could put that money into longer term community owned solutions, there is a lot of wealth there. And I think policy shifts around ethics around those things are going to be very important. It'll take a long time for people to see it, but it's a redesign, I think. Otherwise, we're going to get there via crisis, and that's a real concern.
Well, this is community governance you're talking about. And the whole purpose of local government was to the Office of Public Trust, meaning it is the trust. They have a position of trust that's not supposed to line their own pockets because it's called corruption, but it's also for the public interest. So if we went back to that and we question what is government doing, its purpose is to look after its people, whether it's local, state or federal. And I guess it's only up to us as NGOs and communities to call them accountable. So if we did an audit on where money is going and where it's supposed to be going and how that should be doing, which, you know, many groups have tried and continue to do so. In other countries, we've had whole councils sacked. We've had whole state governments being called to account and gone into receivership, even in other states in Australia, just across the border in New South Wales. So the thing is, we have, it's all very nice to think that we can do things together, and that does happen until there's a divorce or there's discomfort in a cohabitation arrangement, meaning 13 partners in a small community. We've got quite a few good examples of that in South-East Queensland that have tests, you know, served the test of time and done very, very well, and across Queensland for that matter. However, we do question, given that we do pay taxes, given that we are contributing, we do pay GST on everything that we buy. GST comes back as part of the federation arrangement for funding. And if housing is our biggest issue in South-East Queensland, we need to have it a priority and we need to articulate what we want. Now, we know what we don't want, and I guess that's come out fairly clear. We don't want to pay an extra levy because we're probably already paying. We just need to know where the money that is coming back to Queensland is going, or coming into South-East Queensland. And we've got 10 councils in our South-East Queensland and 166 councillors. So the thing is, we do have personal, you know, the councillor who looks after where we live, and we could ask them to do the work on our behalf. So while it's great to have co-housing and good community housing models, I think we had 13 models when we went through this with the AIA back in the last recession, 2008. We had a big workshop and 13 models came out as appropriate models. We had an inquiry with the Queensland government in 2013 and some really good stuff came out of that. But guess what? It's not, you know, recommendations. It's back to accountability and up to us as NGOs and as community to ask the difficult questions. So I guess if nothing else, we can ask difficult questions, each of us. However, do we have other people? I'm still.
Yes, Emma.
Yeah, I just want to. I've got just thinking. You know, I've got two responses in relation to that. Look, one is the flippant response of going, you know, do we start calling billionaires, you know, oligarchs like they do in Russia to make it sound a lot more, you know, distasteful. But just, yeah, one of the things too, out of a figure that really shocked me, Tim Lawless at the housing conference noted that, you know, the current investment in real estate in Australia is over $1 trillion, which is more than what is currently sitting, you know, with super funds. So, you know, the absolute size of, I guess, what we'd probably think of, you know, or maybe I'd just call it self-interest, you know, and I think, you know, what the politics of that is incredibly massive, you know, that if we're looking at solutions or looking towards solutions, that are about, restricting ownership and, limiting the number of properties people have. It's just, to me, when you start going, oh, there's $1 trillion in real estate, residential real estate, that's what we're up against in terms of designing those responses and, anything to do with, capital gain and, all of that sort of stuff. It was just a figure that just absolutely blew me away when I heard that and what that compares to.
And that inequity is the reason why the UN rapporteurs come to Australia, because as a rich country, we should be more compassionate. We think we're ethical. We've got some really good models. They don't last. We've done some really great stuff. It doesn't last. So, what's wrong with our compassion or our ethical decision making or probate? Probate meant that if you didn't give back to the community during your living life, you had to pay a percentage of your, I think it was 10% of your death benefits towards community. So, which is why probate was invented in the beginning. But of course, everyone was terrified of probate, and it's been in the last 20 years has been pulled, 15 maybe. And the whole purpose behind probate has also been lost, and philanthropy has been lost. So, are we getting just fat and inequitable, or and no compassion? Now, you can't say we don't have compassion, because when you look at the floods and that, we do. But no, it's not
structurally, we don't have compassion. Is probably how I'd.
Well, we don't have a charter of fiscal and social responsibility anymore. The Queensland government had that, and we had to measure the ministers and all the portfolios' performance against that. That was repealed a little while back, and that's how we measured the community impact from the budgets and the behaviours of our politicians. But I'm not going to go there. So we've got 2 hands up that I can see, but there might be more. So there's Ritva and Paul. Ritva, do you want to go first? Oh, and Emma.
Oh, no, mine's down.
Okay, sorry. I'll just have to change the, right.
I was going.
Gee,
oh, sorry, you go.
There must be more than 6 of us online.
There's 12 participants, I believe.
Oh, gee. Okay. I know we've gone past 6 o'clock. So are we? No, we've got 15 minutes to go.
How much time do you want to spend more? Do you want to go on to 6?
Well, let us look at the 12 people left in the room and make sure that they've had a voice, and I'll shut up.
Anyone not said anything, would you like to say before Ritva and Paul say something, please? You have an opportunity.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to suggest that the size of $1 trillion and those people who have a vested interest in not changing is very clear. To change the narrative, I think Australians are we are not good at cooperating. Culturally, it's just European nations and First Nations do it by design and for survival. We have been competitive and been very good at that. But I think if there's a spirit and a story that we need to tap into, it is the story of that Anzac myth. And it's evident in the floods, and it's to help out a mate. There are a bucket load of mates in this country who are now and will forever be in a crisis. And if we can find a way to tap into that ethic and actually turn it into almost like a Robin Hood, you can help. That's where I think we really need to look back at the policies, maybe those cooperative policies from a few years ago. We need to find as many of them as ways for people to borrow from Peter to pay Paul and help out your mate. I think that's the cultural narrative. If we don't get that right, if we wait for government or some magic solution, it's going to be a cold day in hell before this gets sorted out. It's really a narrative from the bottom up, and the floods are a really important part of it, but we need those simple solutions times many. Small times many equals big. Still philosophizing, big level. It's not simple stuff. But anyway.
Okay, Ritva?
I agree with Paul, and I was just going to add in terms of compassion, I think we need to kind of think about how humanity works and then how society is working, and how society does involve humanity, but then there are a lot of issues in relation to the economic inequalities and just how organizations, yes, they are built by people. Like that's what the argument always is that organizations are built by humans. It is technically our fault, but it's not all humans that think like this. I think when it comes to just the history of how we've evolved and we've created these organizational structures, it's not everyone's voice that we are hearing. It's usually just a few people at the very top that has been able to accumulate the wealth and then also be able to pass it down through their own generations. And that's a big problem when we try to group everyone into one thing as, oh, humans don't have compassion. I strongly believe that we all as humans have compassion. I think it's more trying to dismantle the whole organizational structures that we've created that don't necessarily listen to everyone's voice equally.
Could I ask Graham Osborne? I don't recognise you, sorry, Graham.
That's right.
You haven't had a chance to say very much, and I haven't seen your name in the box. So,
yeah, no, I just answered some questions there about my verbs were making houses using distributed manufacturing. Been keen on that idea for years, but wikihouse.cc have just launched a new system called Skylark 250, but they've been working as a open lab and an open sourced system for 10 years now. And they've got other research going on in England with local homes where they've done all of government study of vacant land. They're also looking at different land ownership options because England has quite a few different options like housing associations and cooperatives, which we never or did have, but don't exist anymore in Australia. So there's still, I think, some valid arguments that they've launching. So it'd be worth all of us having a look at keeping an eye on what they're doing. And that's wikihouse.cc in London. So the original idea was to cut CNC, cut houses and get people to barn raise them together. That was their original model. So, and it was all open source, and anyone with a CNC machine can download their patterns and print them off. So great vision, but we've had to, in Australia, get engineering and certification and all those other things that you have to do. But we've been working through that now for a couple of years. So we've got all that on board.
well, Graham, I'd love you to have some tropical housing for us in SEQ.
Okay.
There's a few architects who'd love to help you there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for having us today.
Thank you. Okay.
Alani.
Oh, Graham, you're an architect. Were you in Brisbane City Council?
Yes, Lainey. Yeah, I remember you. How are you? Yeah, I think a lot of people have been through that organisation, Lainey.
And survived.
Coming out the other side.
I start back there on Monday.
Oh, good. Okay. Look, today we talked about Sustainable Development Goal 11 and Target 1, which was housing. But housing by itself doesn't exist by itself. When we look at the whole of the SDG 11, which is about sustainable communities, we can't do one without doing the whole other 10 as well. So even though we talked about SDG 11.1, we talked about all of those and a whole lot more. So I'm so pleased you were able to join us. Pam, you haven't had a chance to say anything today. So you're our child-friendly mum.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I keep coming back to something that I heard in an urban design conference in the UK by an Australian, Bill Chandler, who was at this same sort of symposium 5 years ago. And it was that if we take the view of the Aboriginal Australians, that the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. And if you think of it like that, I think about, tearing down all the fences. What do those combined backyards look like? There's a lot of backyards that I see around me that never get used. Yes, they're nice green visual breaks, but why can't children play in all of those areas? Why can't we all play in all those areas? Housing isn't just about your bedroom, the place you sleep, the place you eat. It's also about the place you recreate. And from that perspective, I think the outdoor spaces as well, and we can communalise those or utilise those a lot more. And I actually look to the perimeter block in Spain, Italy, where I've lived, and I look at a lot of that sort of communal living with the deep soil trees and that, and I've mapped a lot of suburbs in Victoria where there are houses around the perimeter, but then just a lot of fences, so nothing combines, and there's not a lot of large canopy trees. And we could convert our model and house a lot more people, but just why don't we do that? Yeah,
that's pretty profound.
Thank you.
I've put that in the recommendation box on your behalf because I didn't want to lose it.
Okay.
So if the last few people, if you'd like to just pop something in the recommendation box, we want to make sure that we've documented enough thoughts of the people in the audience. And Palani, have you had a chance to put your comments in?
I put something too.
Good.
And, but thank you. I think it's nearly 3 minutes. I would like to thank everyone, but I will leave Denal Davis to wind up. And I think Elizabeth was putting a thumbs up, maybe time's up, I think. I don't know.
Yes, it's a map of what we've discussed today.
Yeah.
So Elizabeth, and while that's up, I'm just going to talk about the next couple of months and on the 24th of every month. Next month, it's going to be a Sunday afternoon, so I don't know who we're going to get, but it's going to be about environmental. It's called urban ecology. It's called environmental stewardship and climate change and something other really special. And environmental stewardship, climate change, urban ecology. Anyway, green stuff. We got hopefully Justice Rackerman and Royko, the Professor of Environmental Health, and we wouldn't normally get a professor. We would normally get a person who's a community-based person, but she's everything. And the third person is the South-East Queensland Community Association. They are reformed out of the Friends of South-East Queensland, which I was part of for 14 years, setting up, founding. And we did wonderful things, changed legislation, found money to do all sorts of things, 12 sustainability policies. But that period is over and we're in another lot of governance now, and the seeds we planted are not growing. So I think we need some more fertilizer there. But on that note, Elizabeth, would you like to talk us through what you have?
What do I have for what?
Oh, the word map and the recommendations.
On the yes. So you've shown up the word map, but I can run through the recommendations for future. So we've got we belong to the land.
Your reception's fairly bad, so what I might do is make sure
we only live for 80 years on the land she lives.
Your reception is pretty terrible, so could we make a commitment that we email this out to our participants, especially our panelists? So we haven't officially thanked our panelists, Emma and Ritva, and Rachel has gone to pick up a daughter. So thank you very much for your contributions today. And better than that, what you've actually done in response to the Q&As from people are even richer in the information that you've provided. So Emma, if there's anything that we can do to support your initiatives in future, please let us know, either letter of support from UNAA or comments or data. We've got 20 years worth of data if you need that. No, you won't need that. But please call upon us if you need us in the sorts of things that you're doing, because it's a really big ask what you're stepping into now. And I'm so proud that you're at the helm, because we're right there with you.
Oh no, she disappeared, but she's back now. Sorry, she's back. What you were talking, but I think Elizabeth disappeared, then she's back again.
Oh, okay. Okay. So are we going, rather than persevere with technology that doesn't seem to be working? Can you see? No.
No, she's back now.
Okay.
Yep.
Could you, I've done lots of notes while you've been talking, and I think there's a lot more recommendations or a lot more concepts come out of the Q&A and your words during this process. So I'd like to enrich what's already there so that we don't lose these wonderful gems that we've discussed today. So, and Ritva, she's on our organising team, but today your stories really help us personalise, and we understand that our youth are vulnerable, and the rights of the child, not child, but rights of the young person, really important. Rights of older person is now a UN declaration as of this year, and also the rights of disabled people was a few years ago. So we really do have ongoing obligations to do the right thing. Thank you, Emma. Okay. Shall we say goodnight?
Yeah.
Merva, you're okay, Merva? Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for lasting the distance.